Thank you for the introduction and inviting me down to Portage County. I had a little deja vu driving here this morning. Lived in Cuyahoga County all my life, except for 2 years when I lived at Kent State during my graduate program. So it was a constant drive I was very familiar with, although it looked a lot different than it did when I went to school. But it was a really good 2 years. I got married during those 2 years. I had my first child during those 2 years. I did a counseling internship at Town Hall 2 during those 2 years. So it was busy, productive, and a lot of fun. So just a quick overview of what I'll be talking about today. First, we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about the deaths by suicide in Portage County, Ohio, in the United States. Some discussion about the increasing rates of suicide. And just a spoiler alert, I don't have any answers for it, but I have some thoughts about it. What we're doing basically as a community to address this increase. And then as Dr. Gary said, we'll be talking about the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. So just a quick, again, overview of what I've been doing. I've been at this agency for about almost 25 years. First as part of the mobile crisis team, and then for the last 15 or so, I've been the director of crisis services over a number of programs. The mobile crisis team in Cleveland, which actually covers all of Cuyahoga County, in 2018, we received about 16,000 calls, and we did about 24,000 assessments. We do have this team that goes out in the community, and I think is very valuable. And I think every community should have one. We were talking to Director Chris about the need for that across the state, about how valuable that service is. I also oversee the crisis stabilization unit, and we do about 450 admissions a year there as well. So again, I'm from Cuyahoga County. Our office is in downtown Cleveland, and for those who are familiar, there's a river that kind of cuts the city in half. And you know, people on the east side never go to the west side, or if they do, they have to be back before dark. But so if you have a river, you also have to have bridges. And this is really where my introduction, I believe, is really where my suicide prevention career started, on this bridge. I was working mobile crisis in 1995. It was in August of 95. It was the middle of the night, and I was doing one of the overnight shifts, and law enforcement called and said, there's a gentleman sitting on the bridge threatening to jump, and we need you to come out and help him. So this bridge has they put the light poles, I don't know if you can see it, but the light pole, there's a ledge, there's a guardrail, and then they have a ledge where they put the light poles. But it's also where people can go and sit on the other side of the ledge there. And this gentleman, his name was Robert. I only remember that because when I walked up, law enforcement was on the bridge, and they pulled up. It was like 2 a.m. or something, and they said, they first of all, they wanted to get me out of there because I'm not supposed to be there. And I said, I'm from mobile crisis. And I said, oh yeah, come on. So we got, and they basically said, it's Robert. He's mid-30s, and he's threatening to jump. So I walked over, and I had no idea what I was going to say. This was really kind of I had done many assessments before, but I had not been in this kind of situation where literally, if the person leaned forward, they were going to fall. The bridge is about 100 feet from the water. So I don't remember what I said. I don't really remember what he said, except that I know he had been drinking. He had he was not employed, and he just lost his housing. I don't even remember what the housing situation was, but those were his immediate stressors. And he basically was like, it's just not worth it. Nothing's working for me. Law enforcement had been talking to him for a while, and I know most law enforcement has left, but I wanted a huge shout out because we in the health profession can't really do everything we're supposed to be doing, and law enforcement's there to help. when we get calls on the hotline that we can't get to, it's law enforcement. And I think CIT training has been so valuable to help give the officers a little bit more information, give them some tools to help, because they are usually the people who are doing this kind of work. Luckily, I think he was tired, and I think he thought he was going to get arrested, and I was able to tell him, I think what I can do is get you to a hospital, into a bed, get you a meal, and he was like, all right, let's do that. So I frequently wonder if that had gone a different direction, what my career path would have looked like, because that was really at the start. I was, this is my first 6 months on the job, and I've been there for 25 years. So I was only on the bridge one other time, but I didn't actually have an opportunity to talk to that person because law enforcement took care of that one. So again, a huge shout out to law enforcement. So I usually start with this slide. It's very important to me, how important language is. I'm on a personal campaign to get rid of the phrase commit suicide. I think the word commit has so many negative connotations, whether it's connected to crime or sin or whatever, and it's just, the two go hand in hand, and I think it's part of the stigma behind of suicide and the whole taboo piece of it. And so whenever I see something, especially in the media around committing suicide, I just drop them a little note and say, hey, how about try death by suicide or died by suicide? And the same with the other. I don't think that successful suicide attempt is a good phrase. I don't think unsuccessful attempt is a good phrase. And I also am not, and I know some of our staff are guilty of it in the crisis room, but referring to people with a mental health disorder as, I'm schizophrenic or I'm bipolar. I hear that all the time, as opposed to someone who's dealing with those disorders. I think we just need to break down the stigma and talk more positively about mental illness and the treatment that's available for people. So I'm sure everyone in the room probably is very aware that suicide is a serious public health issue. You can't really do a suicide prevention presentation without talking a little bit about the numbers, about how many people die by suicide, 47,000. We don't have the national 2018 numbers have not come out yet. Everyone expects them to be higher. I'd be shocked if they weren't. We all know that men are way more likely to die by suicide than women. White males, pretty much everywhere, lead in the statistical number of people who die by suicide, and it's usually people in my age group as well. Firearms are a huge problem. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And just some of the things we've noticed in around the increases, that even though 50% of this increase, or there has been a 50% increase in deaths by suicide for females between 2000 and 2016, the numbers are still way smaller than males, who the increase has been 21% over that time. So basically, there's increases in pretty much every age group and race and gender. And also the number of suicide attempts is also very noteworthy as well. So this is a graph of the number of people that have died in Portage County over the last 20 years. And you see, it's very easy to see the upward trend, which I don't think is a surprise to anybody. Certainly there was a couple of years, it's noteworthy that 3 out of 4 have been pretty high. I also changed that to the rate per 100,000, because then you can compare across other areas. And so the 2018, I have at 19 per 100,000 for Portage County. I read something in some document that had it a little bit lower. I double checked my numbers. I sent an email to the person who gave me the number, and I haven't heard back yet. But so the numbers do kind of fluctuate. It's just a population versus number. We know about the 31 deaths by suicide, and we also know the population is somewhere around 163,000. So those numbers, for me, get to about 19. Cuyahoga County, there's still an upward trend there, and there was a huge spike last year in Cuyahoga County. We had over 200 deaths by suicide, which was the first time since 1985 we had seen that number of suicides. And it was a higher percentage because our population is declining. And so you'll see there's some similarities. Ohio, there's an upward trend as well. They were at 14.9 in 2007 because we don't have the Ohio numbers for 2018 as well. So, and then the United States, also an upward trend. And everyone in this area isn't at 15 per 100,000, 14, 15 per 100,000. So if you see a 19 per 100,000, that's alarming, that's concerning. Just like Cuyahoga County had their spike as well. So these are all, this is the Portage County, the Ohio, and the United States all together. So you get a lot more fluctuation when you have a smaller percentage or population that you're dealing with. But all three are on the increase, which is exactly what the media is reporting as well. So the big question, and the question that every suicide prevention conference I go to is, why do people die by suicide? And actually, we kind of know why. We kind of know most people are experiencing something very painful that they don't feel like they can stop. They don't see the end. If they thought it could end in the next week, they probably wouldn't be thinking about suicide. But because they don't feel like there's going to be an end to it, suicide is the only recourse they can think about. They don't really want to die, they just want this pain to come to an end. The problem is, there is no one path to suicide. There are so many different things. It's such a subjective experience for people that I stole this slide, I borrowed this slide from the CDC. And this is the reports of people who, after dying by suicide, that they said, okay, these are the primary problems we're having, and they're all overlapping. And what's not here in the percentages are chemical dependency and mental illness, because those two factors kind of intertwine with all of these types of things, but there typically is some kind of chemical dependency, mental health issue, as well as some other kind of psychosocial stressor that's going on. And it could be very different for many different people, which is a challenge for the suicide prevention field, because it's hard you can't come up with a formula. Like the math doesn't exist yet for us to sit down and say, this person's going to die by suicide, and this person who's going through the exact same circumstances is not going to die by suicide. So my understanding of what's driving some of the increase starts with stigma. I think that asking for help is, for our culture, and especially for men, is extremely difficult to do. It's seen as a weakness instead of a strength. Those of you who are knowledgeable about Brene Brown, who talks about vulnerability and how vulnerability is really, it takes courage to be vulnerable. But that's not our culture. That's not the way we understand it. That's not the way males understand vulnerability. They understand it as a weakness. So reaching out for help is not something they're interested in doing. And men get to this stage in periods of their time, lots of times around retirement or divorce, where there's a big loss, where they go through this thought process about no one needs me, there's no one for me to fix or help, and they get into a depressed mood about that, and that can lead to some serious things if they don't get help. So stigma, and when I talk about what the things we need to do, we need to figure out ways to break down this to increase people's ability to reach out and ask for help. The second thing is access to firearms. We have had a lot of conversations. I'm part of our suicide coalition in Cuyahoga County. We've talked about how to address this, across the United States, about 43% of homes have guns. That is, there's different areas of the United States that have more than that, certainly out west, and that's what drives the higher suicide rates out west, is partially because they have more access to guns. I was extremely alarmed. There was a survey that was done, the risk survey in the schools done, and I saw the results for Cleveland. And one of the questions was asking middle school kids what percentage could put their hands on a gun within the next hour, and it was like 80%. They all know where the guns are, even though the parents hide them. They all know where the guns are, and they all know that they can get access to it, which causes a lot of problems if you have something that is a crisis for them, and they have easy access to a firearm. I just had this one stat here that the United States has 5% of the population and about 50% of the guns in the world. Something that's not talked about a whole lot, at least not what I've heard, is that the more suicides you have, so it's people who are considered suicide survivors are at a higher risk for suicide. So the more suicides that you have in a particular area, that puts more people at risk for suicide. So just the math of it means the more suicides there are, the more people are at risk in that area. And that, I think, is something we need to address. I think that their suicide survivor groups are extremely important. I feel like Cuyahoga County does not do a great job of cultivating that. There are a couple, but there are thousands of people who are suicide survivors in our county, and there's just a handful of people that are taking advantage of these survivor groups. It's an extremely valuable resource that I think is underutilized, at least in my part of the state. And then, so social media, I'm not going to come out and say social media increases the suicide rates. However, we do know that social media certainly is not the most affirming place, especially for young kids. I heard someone talk recently about saying that bullying, that back in my day, I went to school and we experienced bullying. I went home and I was safe from that. Now you can bully someone 24 hours a day, 7 days a week through the phone. There's been these 2 recent cases of where someone has sent repeated texts convincing someone or telling them to die by suicide. And one of them is serving time, the other one's been brought up on charges. And I think that's a very interesting direction to go. And I have 2 young grandsons, and I'm worried about what the world's going to be like when they're old enough to have phones and what pressure that's going to put on them. Because I know that it's there and it does have an impact. So Thomas Joyner in 2005 came out with his interpersonal theory of suicide. And it still is probably the widest accepted theory about suicide. Unfortunately, suicide rates have done nothing but climb since this theory came out, so that's a problem. What I think is that it's a good theory, but as a lot of things, taking research and theory and putting it into practice in real life in the suicide prevention community, that's where there's a breakdown there. So he talks about, in this big blue circle, for those who don't know about this, he talks about this perceived burdensome and thwarted belongingness that's the pool of people who have thoughts of suicide. And then what really made his theory different in 2005 was he said there's this whole other group of people who are actually capable of killing themselves. he basically is saying that the vast majority of people with suicidal thoughts are not capable of killing themselves because of our innate desire to stay alive. It's a hard thing to do, is to kill yourself. And where those two overlap is where he says that's where the suicide attempts and death by suicide happen. So it was, okay, we said, well, so all you have to do is identify these people and we'll see where the overlap is, and there we go. We'll be able to take care of the problem. Well, that doesn't help. That doesn't work. But we just continue to try to understand this capability of acting with self-injury. And there's a lot of interesting components to it. When you think about the people who are at, so he says that you can accrue the ability to die by suicide by certainly past suicide attempts, repeated injuries. It's kind of where some of the ACEs study comes in. People who've been traumatized, we know that, as the more adverse childhood experiences you've had, the higher your risk for dying by suicide. So childhood physical abuse kind of plays into that. And then the witnessing of pain and violence, which was where some of the the professions with a higher rate of suicide, a higher risk of suicide, ED physicians, dentists, police, firemen, military, they all have as a profession, they have a higher rate of suicide than the general public. That kind of fits into this theory. He also says that repeated suicide attempts, and you kind of see this at times where the successive attempt is a little bit more serious than the previous one, that could be someone who's working their way up to getting to a point where they can actually die by suicide. Which is why people who cut, although many times they are using it as a stress relief, it can also be seen as a potential build-up to being capable of dying by suicide. So our current, so as Dr. Garrity mentioned, I'll be talking about the Columbia scale in a few minutes. Our current risk assessment is based on the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline standards, where we talk about suicide desire, capability, intent, and look at protective factors. We've had since 2005. I think we've had the same scale. It's an in-house scale, so we put it together ourselves. We use the Lifeline standards. I think it's fairly functional, but if someone, if I was testifying in the court and someone said, well, what scale did you use? And they said, well, I made something up. It's not going to carry quite as much weight as something that has some evidence behind it. So we'll go in there in a minute. I wasn't going to put a whole lot of risk factors and warning signs into this talk. I was going to have a little bit different approach, but kind of like how you can't do a suicide prevention talk without talking numbers, you also can't do it without at least touching a little bit on some risk factors and warning signs. So what our scale is based on is this emotional pain plus hopelessness equals a likely attempt. So we have, and these are when you're doing a very quick assessment, these are the 5 things that we focus in on. People who are having feelings of hopelessness and helplessness are number 1. And this whole sense of a burden, I think this is also a very important point. People who die by suicide have to get to the point where they believe the people that are leaving behind are going to be better off without them. Most of them, I'm not going to, not across the board, but there's lots of times, most times, they have to get to the point where they believe they're a burden to the people they're leaving behind. And that's an important thing that we're always asking about, is their connection to the people around them. Acute anxiety, social isolation, insomnia are huge when looking at people who are where we believe they might be at risk for suicide. So as far as what is happening in the suicide prevention field, the general trend right now is moving away from trying to predict someone's a suicide attempt, because the research says we're about as good as flipping a coin. So we've kind of moved away from that, the field is moving away from that, more to safety and prevention. More about if you think someone's at risk for dying by suicide, the things we can do that we know make a difference are means restriction, safety planning, and care transition. All three of these have evidence behind them. And if you, I think you're going to have access to the slides. I have links to the three places where you can just look more about this. The counseling on access to lethal means, I think it's a 2-hour training. You can do it online, and I make everybody at my agency do it, even if they think they know everything. And I have a lot of people that think they know everything, but it's something that I feel like you go through it, and if you test out, you get your certificate, and they give me the certificate, and that's fine. It goes through some basic things, and it's mostly focused on firearms and medication, and making sure that we're doing what we need to do to limit the means that people commonly use. Those are the two of the highest means. I think hanging is in there, but those are the two that we can address as far as restricting lethal means. So I would definitely, if you're involved in client care, or if you're around anyone who might be at risk for suicide, it's an easy 2 hours, and it really helps kind of organize some thoughts around how we can take precautions that keep people safe. And there is a lot of evidence around the fact that if someone is thinking about shooting themselves as a way to die by suicide, and you take the access to weapons away, they most likely are not going to go look for another way to do it. They might, but the evidence says that most people will not. If you take the means that they are thinking about away, and at minimum, you're going to lengthen the time, you're going to draw that crisis period out. And we know that people who are in a suicidal crisis they peak up, and then after a period of time it comes back down and it might come back up. But if you can keep them safe during those high risk times, you're probably going to be able to keep them alive. Safety planning, I'll touch on that a little bit in a second, but that it's also a lot of research around sitting with someone and walking through the things that will help keep them alive. A lot of it is identifying people, contacts, reasons for living that they can refer to when they're in a crisis, who they can reach out to. And then care transition. We're actually lucky to be working with the Ohio Suicide Prevention Foundation right now on a care transition. So we are working with, there's like 17 hospitals in Cuyahoga County, and when they discharge someone from their emergency room who, if they were at real high risk for suicide, they'd be admitting them. So these are people that are below that, but they still are going to release people because the bar for admission is sometimes kind of high. So if they're releasing someone who they're a little bit concerned about, they just send us some information, and then we do this care transition, reaching out to them by phone and making sure that they stay safe until they connect with their provider. There's a lot of research behind care transition. A very simple, inexpensive thing to do to help people moving from, especially from a hospital to an outpatient, but it also can be helpful. We do it sometimes when we're transitioning between programs as well. I had this saying in my PowerPoints for a long time that the best form of suicide prevention we have might simply be having the caring person with the right knowledge at the right place at the right time. That speaks a lot to where we are in the suicide prevention field. It's not a whole lot science-based. It's a lot of just educating people about what we can do to keep people in our professional careers and our personal lives alive. And it's keeping that connection with them. And it's feeling comfortable asking the question. Back in September, Suicide Prevention Month, the Be the One was one of the initiatives that was pushed out a lot, and it's the 5-step of asking people about suicide, keeping them safe, being there with them, supporting them, helping them get connected to a provider or someone that can help them, and then following up with that person. And a lot of it was really addressed not professionally but personally, about who in our own lives. I know that we do suicide prevention training in our agency for every new staff person that comes through during their first couple weeks. And during that time, we ask people, and they don't have to answer, but it's one of the questions we ask about, have you lost someone to suicide? Do you know someone died by suicide? And it could be the social service field. I don't think so. I think most people know someone who's died by suicide. There are definitely people who have made suicide attempts who are survivors. They've lost someone close to them. They could be an attempt survivor or a suicide survivor, just like I'm sure there are in this room. I think that trying to reach out to people who we know are hurting, when they're hurting, and being more comfortable doing that is one of the goals that I have when I go out and talk to people. I do think that it feels like I don't have to say anymore, although I probably should, that asking someone about suicide is not gonna, put that idea in their mind. If you're thinking about it, you know that they've been thinking about it, and hopefully they've ruled it out, but that doesn't mean we don't ask. Being more comfortable with talking about suicide, that's something that I'm not sure how we're gonna do this for the general society. I know we can do it for people who come to trainings like this, but I really think this is something that, and I know that we're doing for a number of QPR, the question, persuade, refer trainings through our ADAMS board in Cuyahoga County, and we'll go out to any group of people that wants us, which I think is very helpful. That we're not just hitting social service agencies, but we're going to libraries and schools and businesses and just trying to educate and pass on this information that we need to be more vocal about suicide, because as long as it stays under the radar, we're not going to be able to solve the problem. So I'm hoping some people may have heard about this. Sam says right now studying the possibility of a 3-digit number for suicide prevention. I think it would be a game changer for suicide prevention. There's a lot of work that would have to go into that. Crisis hotlines are not quite staffed for what that would do for them, and so maybe it would bring some much needed funding to the field of suicide prevention. But I think that would be very helpful to have that kind of awareness, because I've been working in Nye County for 25 years, and people just don't know. They don't know about the resources there. They don't know about the crisis hotline. They don't know, and I think that prevents people from reaching out. It adds to the problem of access to care. So I think a 3-digit number would kind of break some of that down. Building resilience, I like the fact that you guys included a wellness and self-care and compassion fatigue session, especially after the suicide prevention talk. That was really good thinking. I think having that available is really, really, really important. I'm happy to say that our agency has a trauma-informed care initiative, and self-care is a huge component of that. So I think that's a great addition to a conference like this. This is also Brene Brown talking about needing to be kinder and gentler to ourselves so we can be kinder and gentler to other people. I think that's so important. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about zero suicide. which, after this slide, I guess I'm gonna talk about zero suicide. So and there is hope. I do think we're making a difference. I wouldn't be in this field for 25 years if I didn't think that what we were doing was making a difference. You know, for every person that dies by suicide, there's another 280 that have thought of it and haven't. And there's another 60 people who have survived a suicide attempt. And so services for those individuals, and most of those individuals do not go on to die by suicide. The vast majority of them do not go on to die by suicide. So having the resources out there, like suicide prevention hotlines, like mobile crisis teams, that increase access to care are very helpful and hopeful. A few years ago, I was at a conference and I heard about zero suicide, and I thought it was ridiculous because here we're seeing this epidemic of suicide rates going up, and we're going to talk about zero suicide. It was a disconnect for me, and I didn't go to the first couple sessions because I thought, I don't get it. But since then, actually in 2018, my agency attended the Zero Suicide Academy, and we are, as an agency, moving through this process. And I'm here going to just talk about, I think it's a very helpful way to think about what we're doing. So it's basically the philosophy behind it is that, all right, we work at an agency. It could be a school. It could be law enforcement. It could be hospital. It could be behavioral health. But the idea is that we have people that we're working with, and the minimum goal should be to keep the people we're working with alive. We might not be able to do, people who don't call my crisis hotline, and there's the vast majority of people who die by suicide in Cuyahoga County have never called my crisis hotline. And so I have to deal with that, I have to figure that out. But at minimum, I need to be keeping the people alive that are contacting my agency and getting services through my services. So zero suicide is a philosophy, and it's a framework, and it's a belief that, okay, we're going to do what we can, and it's supported by a lot of people. It does take leadership commitment. You have to go through the standardized screening and assessment. Actually, this next slide is actually better. So this is what it's all about. You need to be able to universally screen people that you have contact with. So that's the first step. Bless you. The second step is that after you screen somebody, if they test positive, you have to have a risk assessment that is completed. And following that assessment, you have to develop a safety plan. And the safety plan should lead to some kind of evidence-based treatment. And then you periodically reassess the risk, and that there is a specific care path for that person in your EHR. That's the nuts and bolts of this. And it's in the Zero Suicide Academy we attended. And actually, I'm going to give for anyone who's from Stark County, I'll give a shout out to their mental health and recovery board. They brought the Zero Suicide Academy to Stark County, and they invited like all of these agencies in Stark County. And I heard about it, and we were the only non-Stark County agency that came and participated in this. So they were kind enough to let us join. But to do like a community-wide thing where people are kind of working together, and then after the academy, there was a year, so closer to 18 months worth of calls where you're kind of support everybody and talking about what you're doing. But this is a long process. We haven't really begun this. We have begun it. We have a committee and put things together. We've identified our risk form, our screening form, and our assessment form. We're putting together our safety plan. We're going to be training people in CAMs. But they talk about this really being like a 5-year, 10-year plan where you develop over a period of time. You can't do this. This is a huge system change, and you can't do it overnight. So it's something that I'm a believer. I drink the Kool-Aid, and I'm a fan of zero suicide. And I think it's very feasible to do within an organization. There'll be more information. The other thing, even if you don't belong to Zero Suicide, their website is amazing. They have so much information that you could probably start reading it now and it would take you a long time to get through it. So many resources just on the website. It's extremely helpful. So as part of Zero Suicide, we have chosen the Columbia SSRS scale as both the screening form and then the fuller assessment form. So I know John mentioned that these cards are in how it works at our agency. And I will admit that we're not doing this yet. It hasn't been built in our EHR, so we haven't done it yet, but we've made the decision to do it. So, but it's very similar for our crisis hotline using the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline guidelines. For every person who calls in, we have 3 questions that we ask everybody. Are you thinking of suicide? Have you had thoughts of suicide in the last 2 months? And have you ever made a suicide attempt? Those 3 questions get asked to everybody. And if they answer yes to any of those, we then fill out our more fulsome assessment form. So we're going to be doing the same thing. It's basically the same process. It's using these questions. So there's, you're basically asking, I think, 2 questions. Have you wished you were dead or wished that you could go to sleep and not wake up? Have you actually had any thoughts of killing yourself? I think if it's no. If it's yes, then I think you asked the 3, 4, and 5. And then the 6 also asks question 6: have you ever done anything, started to do anything, or prepared to do anything to end your life? Those are just the opening questions, and then you move into this more fulsome assessment that gets into all the other components. So it's a very simple process. I don't know what, because Dr. Garrity did leave, he's on the other room, but I don't know what the strategy is for Portage County. I know that there's he's put out the idea of making use of this. It is, I think that Columbia has a tremendous amount of research behind it. It also, from the website, there are it's enlisted in multiple languages. So if I'm dealing with someone from a different language, there is a self-report component of it that they can use the different language piece of it. There's also for different environments. There's one for law enforcement that they could use. There's one for primary care that they could use. There's a version for under 18, and I think there's even for younger kids. So there's a number of different versions that you could look at the website and identify the version of the Columbia that fits to what your need is. And there's also one that you can use if you're working with somebody over time. So you're not asking them necessarily the exact same questions, but there's a shorter version that maybe you check in with for every session if you're dealing with somebody. It's like I said, there's a lot of research behind it, and our agency is committed to switching over to it mainly because of the research behind it and the flexibility and being able to use different languages. We have a number of different people with when we have a language issue, and some of the risk forms are a challenge for us. But the Columbia, because it's available in many different languages, makes that a lot easier. So Dr. Gary, I don't know if you had other things you wanted to speak to directly about that.
Just that we will be doing trainings, and I mentioned a little earlier, trainings countywide, system-wide for all of our different partners, law enforcement, schools, our behavioral health providers, just everyone that we can reach. And we're going to use that short version just to get everybody on the same page, and hopefully Because there's no questions then, it's definitive. If somebody answers yes to these questions, here's exactly what you need to do to respond to it.
Right,
So,
yes.
everybody's kind of speaking the same language then.
Yeah, there's a huge advantage to doing something like that where everyone's using the same form, the same questions. It just makes it easier as a community to kind of coordinate care between organizations. There is the training. There's a very short video that anyone can access online. The trainings are very simple, and it is a form that you don't need to be a clinician to do. It's specifically set up for basically anyone can do it. So I had a slide that after this that will come out that said, here's my contact information and I'm available for questions, but that slide didn't make it here, so I guess I'm not taking any questions. But I think we do have time for questions.
Okay, sure, absolutely.
Yes.
How often do you find that someone answers those questions dishonestly? Like, are most people forthcoming?
Well, that's a great question. So the question is really about how if people are forthcoming when asking questions. When we're asking the questions. So when somebody calls our agency, our hotline for help, they are typically reaching out for help and they're typically more forthcoming. The problem is that 75% of the calls about suicide, about somebody who's suicidal, come from somebody else. And then, so we're basically gathering information about that individual, and then sometimes it's a cold call, sometimes it's a conference call, sometimes we're going out knocking on someone's door, and then you come to that situation where somebody may be motivated to not tell you the truth. And it's true that if someone is really wanting to die by suicide and they don't want any help, they're probably going to say, yes, I'm fine. And that's probably where I have some very long-term clinicians at my agency. Some people have been with me for 20 years. And so we have concerns about someone, we'll send one of our more experienced people because their BS meter is a little bit more sensitive and can pick up and can kind of find some angles coming through some side doors. But it's a very real thing that we're not always told what's going on. And that's where hopefully the clinical skill kind of comes into play. I'll get to the self-care, don't you?
I have one more, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Do you think, or do you know for sure if the age is rising? Like, well, I guess the youth. It seems like there's more, I don't know if it's just being put in the media more or if it's always been this way, but it seems like kids that are younger age are dying by suicide now. Is that true, or is that just how it's being?
That is true. We are definitely seeing an increase in the younger demographic. So we have programs that are specifically like the suicide prevention program I have with the House Suicide Prevention Foundation is targeting 10 to 24. And I'm telling them how many times people at 7 and 8, we're getting referrals from people, kids who are 7 and 8. I'm not positive. I heard that there was a suicide rule at age 6. I'm not sure that I rule that as a suicide, but but clearly the ages are coming down, and it's very routine to see a 7, 8-year-old who is talking about suicide whether they have a true sense of what that is or whether they're, but we have seen people who died by suicide at that age, and that was not when I was started 25 years ago. That just wasn't happening. I think it's just part of that is social media. I think that people are exposed to things much younger than like when I was young. And so they grow up faster, they get this information faster. And so it makes it something that, when I was 7, I'm sure I didn't even know what suicide was. But a lot of second, third graders do now. So yeah, it is true. Yes.
Do the initial screenings that your folks do, I guess I should say, have they been validated on an adolescent population as well as an adult population?
The current screenings that we're doing at my agency have not been. The Columbia has been. So that's one of the reasons why we are, like my scale line, I like it a lot and I think it's very helpful. It doesn't have any validity data behind it. So to move to something that does makes a lot of sense on a lot of different levels.
I can remember the call I took from a teen who said he was going to kill himself and then his parents would be sorry and they would treat him better.
Yeah. Well, you certainly get some of those kind of thoughts from the younger demographic for sure. And I mentioned nothing about crisis chat and crisis text that our agency does, and because it made me think of it from the younger demographic and how you'll get a message that says, I'm gonna kill myself, what are you gonna do about it? That's how they start the conversation. And this is from 10, 11, 12-year-old. And they are way more comfortable texting than talking on the phone. So I think it's a very valuable resource to have because that's the way that we can reach that demographic.
Question. Just out of curiosity, if you see any increase related to the opening of casinos in private county, because gambling is one of the highest rated suicides.
One of the weaknesses, so I get notified of every ruling by our medical examiner, every ruling of suicide and homicide in our county. And they send some information, but they don't send that kind of information that I think we really need to understand better. I think one of the gaps in our knowledge is what's happening locally. Some of like the CDC can tell me what's happening nationally, but it is very helpful to know what's happening locally. I get the age. I don't even get the marital status anymore. I get the age and the gender and the race and where they live and where they died. And that's also helpful because I have done pointed, like I can identify a community, and actually, you guys actually have that. I saw some higher communities in Portage County with a higher rate than some other counties when I was preparing for this. And so I directed some of our suicide prevention awareness campaigns in those areas, trying to impact that. But to understand something like gambling, how gambling impacts our suicide rate, I don't have that kind of information. I'm not currently getting that information, but I think that's, in order for us to take the next step, we probably need that kind of information so we know where we can target some of our intervention.